7 supernatural events occurred shortly after Moses' death and completely changed the course of history. After Moses was gone, nothing was ever the same again. Prepare yourself, because what happened after his death may transform everything you thought about this narrative. After 120 years leading an entire nation through the wilderness, Moses ascends Mount Nebo, gazes from afar at the promised land he would never set foot on, and there brings his journey to an end. The silence of that moment inaugurates a profound transition. The leader who parted the sea, received the law, and spoke with God as one speaks with a friend, now disappears from the scene, and heaven itself seems to react to the end of an era. The biblical account affirms something unprecedented. God himself buried Moses in a valley in the land of Moab. No other figure receives such an intimate description regarding their burial. There are no monuments, no inscriptions, no pilgrimages, only mystery. To this day, no one knows where that tomb is, and this absence fuels questions that span millennia. Yet the enigma deepens when the small book of Jude, verse 9, reveals a confrontation invisible to human eyes. The archangel Michael and Satan disputed over the body of Moses. It was not merely a corpse, but something that carried spiritual significance. Some scholars suggest that the adversary wanted to turn that place into an object of idolatry, diverting the people from true worship. Others recall that Moses had failed when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, and perhaps Satan sought to claim authority over him because of that error. Whatever the reason, Michael does not respond with insults, but invokes divine authority. "The Lord rebuke you." The result is the complete disappearance of the body, hidden in such a way that no expedition, tradition, or archaeological discovery has ever located it. A silence that has lasted more than 3 millennia, reinforcing the idea that something greater was at stake. Years later, another episode adds an even more intriguing layer. Moses appears alive alongside Jesus on a mountain, speaking as someone who has crossed through death itself. For many, this raises deep questions about purpose, redemption, and spiritual continuity. For others, it remains a powerful symbol of what transcends human understanding. The fact is that the death of Moses did not merely represent the end of a leader. It marked the beginning of a sequence of signs pointing to a new phase for Israel. The disappearance of his body was only the first indication that something extraordinary was happening. And while the people were still trying to understand this transition, another radical change emerged the very next morning. For 40 years, manna had fallen from heaven daily, sustaining millions of people in the wilderness. It was more than food. It was a constant reminder of divine provision. Yet after the death of Moses and the crossing of the Jordan, the miracle ceased abruptly. That morning, men and women left their tents with baskets in hand, expecting to find the heavenly bread scattered across the ground. But there was nothing. Only sand, stones, and the wind passing through the camp. The murmur began to grow. How will we survive now? The manna, described as a white substance sweet like honey, had been the daily sustenance of an entire generation that never needed to plant or harvest. Now, standing before the promised land, God seemed to be leading them into a new level of responsibility. The end of the manna marked the symbolic closing of the wilderness. The people would need to learn to cultivate, to wait for the seasons, and to trust in a different way. The change was abrupt and frightening. Some looked at Joshua with suspicion, comparing him to the former leader. "With Moses we had guaranteed food," some said. Has God abandoned us? Others questioned, not realizing they were witnessing a new stage of the promise beginning to unfold. But Joshua remained firm in the face of the people's unrest and explained that the promised land was indeed a land of abundance, yet it would not be sustained by the same daily miracles of the wilderness. A new season was beginning, a time in which divine blessing would be manifested through human effort. The cycle of manna had come to an end, and the nation needed to learn to cultivate the land flowing with milk and honey. In the first months, the adaptation was difficult. Many rationed what little remained while learning agricultural practices they had never known. Some faced hardship. Others returned to eating foods similar to those they remembered from Egypt. It was a profound shock, not only economic, but also emotional and spiritual. Even so, something extraordinary began to emerge slowly. When the first harvest arrived, the people realized that this land was different. The wheat grew tall under the sun, the fruit was sweeter than any memory of the wilderness, and the olive trees produced oil in abundance. It was as if the land itself were rewarding decades of waiting and wandering. Even so, many still missed the manna. There had been a unique security in waking every morning and finding food already prepared, a visible reminder of the divine presence. Now that connection had to be cultivated in another way, not merely by waiting for miracles, but by working with faith. The end of the manna represented a profound shift in the relationship between God and His people. Daily dependence gave way to a more mature partnership. God gave the land, and the people learned to steward it. The last jar of manna was kept inside the Ark of the Covenant as a testimony of a unique season, a silent reminder of when heaven fed the earth every day. For future generations, it would stand as a sign that miracles had not disappeared. They had simply taken new forms. This transition taught a powerful lesson. The end of a miracle does not mean abandonment, but growth. Israel was entering a new phase, one in which faith would be demonstrated not only by waiting for provision from heaven, but by working the land while trusting that the blessing would come at the right time. But while the people were still trying to understand this change, God made it clear that the transformation would not be merely external. It would also be spiritual. And when everything seemed finally ready for war, an organized army, territory ahead, and the expectation of conquest, came an order that no military commander would have dared to give. Before facing any enemy city, Joshua received a surprising instruction: to completely halt the advance and circumcise an entire generation. During the 40 years in the wilderness, many men had not been marked by the covenant. The generation that left Egypt had passed away, and the sons born along the journey grew up without that physical sign representing commitment to God. It was as if Israel was about to claim a promise while carrying an incomplete identity. Imagine the scene. The entire army camped in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by hostile nations, and suddenly thousands of warriors became vulnerable, wounded, unable to fight. From a human perspective, it was a risky decision. Any attack at that moment could have meant the end of the nation before the first battle even began. But God was not concerned with military logic. He was restoring something deeper. It was there that a powerful declaration came. "Today I have removed from you the reproach of Egypt." The place was called Gilgal, a name that carries the idea of something being rolled away, as if the past were finally left behind. That act was not merely physical, it was symbolic. It marked the definitive closing of the wilderness mindset and the spiritual birth of a new generation. Before tearing down walls, Israel needed to remember who they were. Before conquering territories, they needed to renew the covenant. And in that silent moment, far from battles and trumpets, God showed that true victory begins in the heart, not on the battlefield. But this was not the only change brought about by the absence of Moses. While a new generation was being marked by the covenant at Gilgal, something even deeper was happening behind the spiritual scenes of Israel. The death of Moses altered the very way God communicated with the people. The feeling was similar to losing an essential connection at the most decisive moment in history. For 40 years, Moses had been the direct mediator between heaven and earth, someone who spoke with God face to face, as a friend speaks with another. Whenever doubts arose, he would ascend into the divine presence and return with clear answers. When crises threatened the nation, he came back with firm direction. It was as if Israel had an open line to the divine. With his death, that exclusive channel closed, and a quiet unrest spread throughout the camp. Joshua assumed leadership, but he did not possess the same kind of intimate access, and a question began to echo among the tents. Who would now hear God on our behalf? Urgent decisions had to be made, imminent battles, the division of territories, judgments among the tribes, and it was in this context that a new system of spiritual guidance emerged. The Urim and the Thummim, kept in the breastpiece of the high priest, began to be used to discern divine answers. For many, the change was abrupt. Before, there had been long and detailed conversations. Now, simple responses, almost silent, like signs that required careful interpretation. It was a new way of learning to listen, less dependent on a single voice and more grounded in a collective search for God's direction. And perhaps it was precisely in that moment of silence and adaptation that something unexpected happened, a reminder that even when the way of hearing changed, the divine presence had not disappeared. If anyone still thought that the death of Moses had left Israel without spiritual direction, what happened next completely changed that perception. Joshua stood before Jericho, a city surrounded by massive walls, seemingly impossible to conquer. There was no obvious military strategy, no sufficient technology, and for the first time, the new leader faced a responsibility that had once belonged to Moses. It was night. Silence filled the camp. And then something unexpected happened. A man appeared before him, standing firm with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua did not know whether he was facing an enemy or an ally. The tension was absolute. He asked, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The answer that came was even more mysterious. "No, I am the commander of the army of the Lord." In that instant, all human logic disappeared. Joshua fell face down to the ground, recognizing that he stood before an authority that did not belong to the ordinary world. It was as if heaven itself had interrupted history to remind him of something essential. Israel's leadership had never been based solely on men. The true commander had always been present, only invisible. Without Moses, God had not withdrawn. On the contrary, he was guiding this new phase in an even more direct way, preparing Joshua to understand that victory at Jericho would not come by strength or human strategy, but by obedience to a supernatural command. This encounter marked a quiet turning point in Israel's history. It was not merely a human leader replacing another, it was the revelation that heaven still stood at the forefront of the battle. And from that moment on, Every step toward the Promised Land would be guided not only by courage, but by the certainty that an invisible army marched with them. Yet despite this extraordinary intervention, the way God would lead the people continued to transform. Over time, prophets began to arise as messengers, receiving visions and dreams that required understanding and discernment. Unlike Moses, who spoke with direct clarity, these new instruments brought messages that demanded reflection and collective faith. This also opened space for doubt and conflict, since not everyone who presented themselves as prophets was genuine. Without Moses to confirm every word, the people needed to develop spiritual discernment, and the question remained in the air. How could one distinguish the voice of God amid so many human voices? The people began to live under a new kind of vulnerability. Without the direct presence of Moses, false messengers started to appear, bringing words that confused rather than guided. To protect the community, criteria were established. Any prophecy had to come to pass. It could never contradict the law given at Sinai, and above all, it could not lead the people toward the worship of other gods. The absence of direct communication with God profoundly transformed collective spirituality. Before, it was enough to bring a problem to Moses and wait for a divine answer. Now, Israel had to learn to trust more in the written law and less in constant revelations. The priests gained prominence in this new scenario. They were the ones who consulted the Urim and the Thummim, interpreted the commandments, and mediated spiritual decisions. Religious authority, once concentrated in a single figure, began to spread among spiritual and community leaders. This change, though uncomfortable at first, propelled a quiet maturation. Without depending on a constant intermediary, many began to develop a more personal relationship with God. Individual prayer gained strength, and meditation on the law became essential. It was like leaving the security of a familiar house and learning to walk with personal responsibility.
Some scholars see this phase as a necessary preparation for the future. If Israel had remained dependent on a single mediator, it might never have reached collective spiritual maturity. The death of Moses did not merely close an era, it forced an evolution in the way of believing, obeying, and discerning. The model that emerged afterward, built upon prophets, priests, and the scriptures, would deeply influence all later religious history. Yet while this transformation was unfolding, an unexpected crisis nearly pushed the nation toward collapse. Without Moses to balance the tensions, a serious conflict began to form among the tribes themselves. The cause seemed simple, but it carried enormous consequences. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had received lands east of the Jordan, according to an agreement made with Moses while he was still alive, on the condition that they help conquer the rest of the Promised Land. After fulfilling their part, they returned to their regions. Up to that point, everything seemed in order. But when they built a massive altar on the banks of the river, suspicion arose immediately. The other tribes interpreted the act as spiritual rebellion. There can be only one altar before the tabernacle, they said. Within hours, warriors were summoned and an army formed, ready to face their own brothers. Tension escalated quickly, and without the unquestioned authority of Moses, no one knew how to resolve the impasse. Joshua bore the weight of leadership while the people were divided between fear and indignation. Decades of unity in the wilderness seemed on the verge of collapsing into a devastating internal conflict. Then a wise decision changed the course of history. Before attacking, they sent a delegation led by Phinehas, the son of the high priest. The question was direct. Did that altar represent betrayal? The answer surprised everyone. The eastern tribes explained that it was not meant for sacrifices,
but as a memorial, a symbol of unity for future generations so that they would never be excluded for living beyond the Jordan. The explanation brought relief, though suspicion did not disappear completely. This episode revealed deep cracks in the structure of the nation. Without the centralizing presence of Moses, each tribe began to act with greater autonomy. Decisions became more collective, but also more complex and sometimes chaotic. Small conflicts arose over territories, water sources, and pasture lands. The spirit of unity that had sustained Israel for 40 years in the wilderness now seemed threatened by regional interests. Recognizing the danger, Joshua called for a great assembly. All the tribes were gathered to establish new agreements and preserve their collective identity. There, a more distributed system of leadership began to take shape, based on tribal elders who would meet regularly to resolve disputes and guide decisions. It was the beginning of a primitive form of decentralized governance, a necessary step to keep the nation united in a season without Moses, and a sign that Israel was entering a new chapter in its history. But the trauma of that near civil war left deep marks on Israel's collective memory. The eastern tribes came to be viewed with a certain reserve, as if a shadow of distrust hovered over them. In the centuries that followed, those regions would be among the first to suffer foreign invasions and to lose part of their Israelite identity. The episode revealed something unsettling. The death of Moses had created a leadership vacuum that no one fully knew how to fill. A charismatic leader whose voice united the nation had departed, leaving behind a people accustomed to obeying without question. Now they had to learn to dialogue, negotiate, and handle internal differences without the presence of an absolute authority. There is a quiet irony in this story. Moses spent 40 years preparing Israel to enter the Promised Land, but perhaps not to live without him. The altar that nearly caused a war received the name Ed, witness, remaining as a reminder that the unity of a nation can be fragile when clear direction is lacking. It was not only a physical monument, but a symbol of the human tensions that arise when a generation must learn to walk on its own.
And yet, something surprising began to happen. In the midst of chaos, doubt, and change, Israel entered a quiet transformation. Those who had once been slaves and wanderers began to assume a new identity. What had been a nomadic people, dependent on daily miracles, started to become an organized society. The death of Moses, which seemed like the end of everything, ultimately became the starting point of an unexpected process of nation building. The first major change was territorial. Without the centralizing leadership of the former prophet, each tribe had to take direct responsibility for its portion of land. Joshua divided Canaan among them by casting lots, a method meant to ensure fairness and prevent favoritism. Families who had lived for generations in tents began to build houses of stone. Nomadic shepherds learned to plant, harvest, and establish roots. It was a deep social revolution, almost silent, yet irreversible. Politically, the transformation was also striking. The laws received at Sinai ceased to be merely spiritual guidance and began to function as the legal foundation of a new nation. Without Moses to judge every situation, local judges emerged among the elders of the cities. Regional courts began to resolve more complex disputes, while a council of leaders sought decisions that affected all the tribes. It was the birth of a legal structure that would shape collective life. The economy changed along with the land. In the wilderness, survival depended on divine provision and constant sharing. Now, with their own territories, markets, trade, and agricultural production emerged. Israel began interacting with neighboring peoples, absorbing cultural and technological influences. Metalwork, construction, and new forms of social organization started to shape everyday life. The Hebrew language gained new expressions, cuisine diversified, and contact with other nations brought both challenges and opportunities. Militarily, Israel stopped acting like a crowd on the move and began organizing itself as a tribal confederation. Each tribe defended its territory, but united in the face of external threats, forming the early framework of a future national army. Religiously, worship also underwent changes. Although the tabernacle remained the spiritual center, local altars began to appear, strengthening Israel's presence in different regions, even though this would later generate spiritual tensions. The most fascinating part is that all this transformation happened precisely because Moses was no longer there. His absence forced the people to grow, to assume responsibility, and to build their own structures. It was like a child who only learns to walk when the guiding hand finally lets go. Scholars call this period the era of the Judges, a phase that lasted about 2 centuries, marked by challenges, victories, and crises. Yet it was during this turbulent time that Israel ceased to be merely a people on a journey and began forming a unique national identity, prepared for the chapters still to come. The irony of this story is profound. Moses spent his entire life trying to shape a nation, guiding a people through miracles, failures, and new beginnings. Yet it was precisely his absence that created space for Israel to finally become what it was destined to be. For decades, his voice had been the center of decisions, the balance between God and the people. When that voice fell silent, a void emerged, and with it, the opportunity for growth. The death of Moses did not merely mark the end of an extraordinary leadership. It marked the moment when Israel had to take responsibility for its own path. Without the constant presence of the prophet, each tribe had to mature, learn to listen, discern, and act. It was a painful process, full of uncertainty, yet necessary. After all, there are moments when a leader's greatest legacy is not only what he builds while he lives, but the space he leaves for others to continue the work. Thus, from the ashes of loss, something new was born. Israel ceased to be merely a people led by one man and began to become a nation sustained by a covenant, by laws, and by a living collective memory. The remembrance of Moses remained as a spiritual foundation, but the future no longer depended solely on him. It was the beginning of a journey in which every generation would need to choose between repeating the past or writing its own story. And it was from this quiet transition between grief and hope that Israel learned to walk on its own, carrying the teachings of the great leader who had departed, yet building, step by step, a destiny that now belonged to them. May God bless you, and I'll see you soon.